Amazing. So we have a lot of stuff on the docket, okay? This might be ambitious, and I'm going to do my very best to move us through all of it. I've timed it out, but things never always, don't always go the way that you anticipate when you're doing things in real time. But an overview of what we'll be discussing today, we will be talking about the history of Jewish people in Canada, right? So like, how did Jewish people come to be in Canada? What was the process of immigrating? And what are Jewish folks' experiences of inhabiting Canada today? Like, what is that lived experience like? Then we're going to talk a little bit about post-war era solidarity. So thinking about, in a US context, why is it that Black and Jewish people came to be in solidarity in the first place? What were the conditions of possibility for that? How can we think about that? Why does that matter? After that, we'll kind of transition to discussing the rise of Black power and Zionism. So there's all this discourse about how incredible the solidarity was between the Black and Jewish community during the civil rights era and the civil rights movement in the 1950s, but we kind of see this deteriorate in the second half of the 20th century. And I want to know why. I want to explore why. So that's what we're going to discuss in that section of the presentation. After that, we'll also talk about Jewish assimilation into whiteness. So what does that mean? What is the concept of conditional whiteness? Why is that important? And who is able to even have access to assimilating into whiteness? We'll also be discussing Israel and Palestine today, and I will mention this again when we get to that section of the presentation, but in this conversation, my intention is not to convince you to be pro anything. My entire goal is just to add more nuance to the conversation and more texture so that you all can form more informed, thoughtful opinions, right? Like on your own. So this is not prescriptive. This is an exploration, a collective exploration. After that, we'll talk a little bit about white supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Black racism. So what are the ways that anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are fundamental components of white supremacy? How do these two things foundationally undergird white supremacy? And why is that important to think about? And we'll talk about definitions and stuff too, because I don't want to assume that everyone's arriving with the same background and the same definitions and terminology, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course, we're going to talk about diversity in the Jewish community. So folks will often say, the Jewish community is so diverse, so diverse. Okay, well, what does that look like, right? Like I'm interested in exploring the specificities of that. So we're going to talk about Kaifeng Jews in China. We're going to talk about Black and Jewish folks like me, the many iterations that we can come to be, and so on and so forth. So that will be a section of the presentation. And then we're going to do a workplace scenario exercise. So I've kind of personally designed some instances, and we'll go over this later, some instances of maybe slightly problematic things that can be said in the workplace as it pertains to Jewish folks. And so I'll kind of put you into breakout groups, and you're going to think about what would be the best way to respond in that situation, what would be the best way to handle that situation, and then we'll come back as a group and discuss it. And we'll also talk about contemporary examples of anti-Semitism. So we might talk about Kanye West a little bit, his whole spiel, and then kind of end on a positive note of like future directions. What do we do with all this information? What is the action that takes place? So that's a mouthful. I will say, like, the first kind of part of this presentation is more so me giving some historical grounding so that we can have an informed conversation, right? So I'm going to be talking for a decent chunk here up front, and then I'm going to stop talking so much. We're going to watch some media. I'm going to hear from you, and we'll kind of bounce off of one another. Sound cool? Awesome. Oh, amazing. So I want to begin by talking about anti-Semitism over the last couple thousand years, very briefly, which is a difficult task, but I think it's really important to understand what are some of the common myths and tropes that circulate around the Jewish community, and how have those then come to fruition in a Canadian context. So that's the point of this. What's the historical grounding of how Jewish folks have been treated across time and space? Okay, so from as early as the first millennium, the Christian church held Jewish people responsible for Jesus's crucifixion. So this is one of the first fallacies that emerges, that Jewish people are responsible for Jesus's crucifixion. And this is kind of being circulated by the Christian church in the first millennium. And as the church sought to dominate throughout Europe, so to spread its rhetoric, we see that Jewish people with their quote unquote divergent religious practices were perceived as a threat. In 7th century Europe, the Spanish monarchy, aided by the church, demanded that Jewish people either choose to be baptized or to become slaves. So we also see this dialogue emerging of forced conversion. We want Jewish people to forcibly be a part of the church, and if they're not, then we're going to punish them for that. So this idea of Christian hegemony, you're going to hear me say that word a lot, Christian hegemony. And so this is one of countless examples of the attempted conversion of Jewish people to Christianity throughout history, revealing the extent to which the Christian majority would continue to punish Jewish people for adhering to their own beliefs and customs. So during the Middle Ages, we're jumping forward. So from the first millennium to the Middle Ages, there is this idea of the blood libel myth. Okay, so what is the blood libel myth? This is this idea that Jewish people consumed the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes. So this is another myth, another trope that circulates. I know it sounds ridiculous because it is, but this was widely believed throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. And so this myth claims that Jewish people used the blood of Christian children in the baking of our ceremonial breads, challah, for holidays like Passover, or in substituting it for wine, celebrating the Sabbath and other special events. And so such notions regarding Jewish people as bloodthirsty, as Christian hating, are being spread throughout Europe in the effort to kind of uplift Christianity and make a case for why being Jewish or converting to Judaism is not desirable. Fast forward a little bit more to the 19th and 20th centuries, and now we see that anti-Semitism is also being based on another mythology, the mythology that Jewish people allegedly plan to vie for political and economic world domination. So this is this myth that we hear circulating now, that Jewish people run the world, Jews run the world, they control all the banks, they control the entertainment industry, they control everything, the Illuminati, et cetera, et cetera. And such conspiracy theories were popularized by a document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Okay, if you take a Jewish Studies 101 class, this is probably one of the first things you'll talk about. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was originally published in Russia in 1905. And essentially, it describes the alleged plans of Jewish-led secret organizations and agencies to control and manipulate political parties, the economy, the press, and public opinion. And so this book became incredibly popular across Europe and North America. It was not published by a Jewish person. It was completely fabricated by non-Jewish folks who were playing into this notion of Christian hegemony to isolate and other Jewish people. And the protocols kind of were taken up in really problematic ways to make a case for this fallacy of Jewish people running the world. Interestingly and disturbingly, influenced by the protocols text, Adolf Hitler, who, let me raise a hand, are we familiar with Adolf Hitler? We know about Hitler, the Holocaust, at least in a general sense, yes? Okay, good. I'll take the temperature like that from time to time because I want to make sure we're all on the same page, and if we're not, I'm happy to kind of fill in the gaps. Okay. So influenced by the protocols text, Adolf Hitler, and in developing his early anti-Semitic views, emphasized that Jewish people were vying for global economic influences and power. So that's part of the justification for the Holocaust. Jewish people are trying to take over the world. Jewish people are a racial subjugated other. They are a vermin that needs to be extinguished. And so this is how we justify this horrible, brutal, genocidal thing that we're doing. So we see the way that these texts are traveling through space to justify the subjugation of Jewish folks, right? And so in the mid-1910s, the Nazi Party comes to power. And we see that Nazi racial theories, interestingly, were heavily influenced by late 19th century Western pseudoscientific theories known as eugenics. So are we familiar with this term eugenics? We heard that before? Is this a new concept for us? Okay. So eugenics is the practice of genetic selection as a means for eliminating societal problems by quote unquote purifying the human race. So this idea of essentially weaponizing science to create a schema, a racial hierarchy where white people are at the top, and using science wrongly to justify as to why that is, why white folks are the superior race and everyone else falls somewhere else on that strata of this constructed racial hierarchy. And so eugenics theories judged marginalized groups in society, such as people of color, as well as the physically and mentally disabled and challenged folks, as inferior or subhuman. So there are many ways that this hierarchy becomes like not just racialized, but also disability politics comes into this, gender politics comes into this, sexualized politics come into this, right? And we see that Hitler and his German allies drew very heavily upon such claims to scaffold their racial theories about Jewish folks and marginalized groups. After Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Nazi racial theories received greater public exposure in Germany. So there's this, the takeaway from that is that there is this exchange of ideas happening between the United States, the continental United States, and Nazi Germany about eugenics, about racial theories of how the world should be. And Adolf Hitler is very inspired by the eugenics movement that's happening in the United States. So I think sometimes these are imagined in isolation. That's why I emphasize that, because there is a shared like anti-Semitism that's circulating, right? Okay, so specifically, the specificity of Nazi racial theory was that it divided human beings into racial categories defined along genetic lines. So you have Aryan people, German peoples who are believed to be biologically superior, the quote unquote master race destined to rule the world. And then you have Jewish folks, Romani folks, folks who are disabled, Black people who are these undesirable people that need to be extinguished because they're not serving the nation state. So that's like a very truncated crash course and like how Jewish folks have been treated differently across space and place. There's obviously more, but just to sort of ground us before we jump into the context of Canada. Does all that make sense? Are there any like major questions or queries so far? Everything okay? Cool. Amazing. So let's talk a little bit more about the specific context of Canada. So the first known Jewish people to settle in Canada were actually a handful of men who arrived in what we now know as the province of Quebec in 1760. So there have been Jewish folks in Canada since the late 1800s. And they actually came to Canada as part of a British Army regiment. Until the last quarter of the 19th century, Canada's Jewish community actually remained very small and was largely populated and located in Quebec. So there was about 1,000 Jewish people in Quebec and actually Ontario until 1861, based on the 1861 Canadian census, excuse me. And so at this time, because there weren't many Jewish people in Canada, anti-Semitism remained at a relatively low level. This is also pre-Holocaust, pre-World War II, pre-all of that, right? So anti-Semitism has highs and lows. There are moments where it's a little more quelled and other moments where it comes more clearly to the fore. And this is kind of a quelled moment in the late 1900s. Things start to shift with the first substantial wave of Jewish immigration to Canada, which occurred during the end of the 19th century. So now we're getting past this 1861 census date, we're getting more into the 1880s, 1890s, things start to shift. We see more Jewish folks immigrating to Canada. From 1871 to 1901, Canada's Jewish population rose from about 1,300 to over 16,000. So that's almost a 16x increase in the Jewish population in Canada. The reason that a lot of Jewish folks were going to Canada was because they were attempting to escape mounting persecution and violence that they were experiencing in the Russian Empire, right? So we have these massacres that are happening in the Russian Empire directed against Jewish folks, and people are fleeing for their lives. So that's why we start to see this big wave of Jewish folks coming to Canada. Also, people are fleeing from Poland as well as Romania. So these massacres are happening in multiple locales across Europe. And during the 20th century, this prompted the largest wave. So now we're fast forwarding another century, the largest wave of Jewish immigration ever recorded in the country. So more than 60,000 people, 60,000 Jewish people immigrated to Canada between 1901 and 1911. So in a span of 10 years, you have 60,000 Jewish people fleeing for their lives coming to Canada, running away from Romania, from Poland, from Russia. And more than 30,000 of these individuals lived in Quebec by 1911. So we see that half of these folks who are coming to Canada are located in Quebec, which I think is very interesting if we think about an epicenter of Jewish life in Canada. This period also denotes one of the largest waves of immigration in Canadian history in general. So beyond Jewish folks, you have 1.5 million individuals who are immigrating to Canada at this point. So this is a very transitory moment in history, this early part of the 20th century. Okay, so Jewish folks were not really seen as quote unquote desirable immigrants. So what do I mean by that? Quote unquote desirable immigrants are folks that are seen as serving whatever it is that the nation state needs, whatever it is that Canada needs. And as a blossoming country, Canada really wanted and needed folks who could do agricultural work, who specialized in agricultural work. And for that reason, Jewish folks were not seen as desirable because that was not necessarily a field that many Jewish people were, specialized in per se, at least in their approximation. I'm almost done with the historical part. I know everyone's like, oh my gosh, but we're moving through. I think it's really helpful. I think it's really, really helpful and really fascinating. Amazing. So the Canadian government's immigration laws during the Holocaust. So now we're moving to the middle of the 20th century, 1933 to 1945, the Holocaust. The Canadian government's immigration laws during the Holocaust made immigration to the country nearly impossible for European Jews. So in the latter half of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, we see a lot of Jewish folks, over 60,000 Jewish people coming to Canada, fleeing for their lives because of all these massacres that are happening across Europe. And then boom, the Holocaust, right? And more people are trying to flee for their lives. And Canada says, no, we don't want you. You're not deemed as a desirable immigrant. We don't want you to come here. And so we're going to create legislation that bars your entry into this country. We also see that even for the Jewish people that were able to get to Canada, there's a whole host of discriminatory practices that are unfolding. So for example, in Quebec, where, as we established, a large portion of the Jewish population in Canada is at this time, McGill University, which to my understanding is a very prestigious university in Canada, had a sizable Jewish population in the 1920s. And by the early 1930s, the university's newly introduced Jewish quota curbed Jewish enrollment substantially. So suddenly we see universities creating quotas for how many Jewish people that they're willing to accept. And this is not unique to Canada. We'll discuss this a little later, but this also happened in the United States. Universities they have a quota for Black people because they don't want Black folks. They have a quota for Jewish people because they don't want Jewish folks, because these are people on the margins and they want to keep them there. Because what does higher education do? It gives you the tools and the access to community for social mobility, for uplift, and that disrupts an established racial hierarchy, right? So that's not the desired outcome for people who are invested in maintaining that racial hierarchy, that fucked up hierarchy. I don't know. Sometimes I curse my presentations. I hope that's okay, but deeply messed up. So anti-Jewish persecution in Nazi Germany and beyond intensified during the 1930s under Adolf Hitler's regime, of course, and many Jewish people were desperate to escape. Yet even as the Nazis' ambitions to eradicate the Jewish people were becoming clear, so even as the world started to realize what was going on in Nazi Germany, very few countries would open their borders to Jewish folks fleeing for their lives. Canada was one of many nations that refused to admit Jewish people trying to flee the anti-Semitic oppression that would accumulate in the Holocaust. Because there's a whole lead up to this, right? It wasn't just we snap our fingers one day and it's the Holocaust. There's all this subjugation and discrimination leading up to that moment where folks are like, oh, we need to bounce, we need to go. And Canada is like, no, you can't come here. Okay. So despite the frantic efforts of advocates both within and beyond the Canadian Jewish community, Canada would only admit a small number. So once the Jewish Canadian community pushed, a very small number of Jewish folks attempting to escape Nazi oppression. So between 1933 and 1948, this is over 10 years, this is like 15 years. In 15 years, less than 5,000 Jewish refugees were allowed into Canada. Less than 5,000. This is the smallest number of any allied nation. I think that's really important. And so this period from the beginning of the First World War to the Second World War represents the zenith, according to historian Robinson, zenith of Canadian anti-Semitism. Its manifestations included physical harassment, discrimination in Canadian universities, exclusion from professions such as medicine, social exclusion, and anti-Jewish retail and business boycotts. So as Jewish folks are fleeing, we see this anti-Semitism brewing in a Canadian context. There were also numerous pro-Nazi groups in Canada in the 1930s. They didn't quite take a foothold, obviously like they did in Nazi Germany or even in the United States and like the neo-Nazi movement here, but they were definitely present. So fast forward to the present day. What does all this mean for us right now, right here today, and the clients that you'll be working with? So according to the Statistics Canada, 58% of all religiously based hate crimes reported in 2012 in Canada were perpetrated against Jewish people, so totaling in 242 crimes. So 58% of all religiously based hate crimes, so more than half of religiously based hate crimes that are happening in Canada, at least as of 2012, that's a little bit of a dated statistic, I didn't find anything more recent, was against Jewish people. I think that says something. What's that about, right? And according to the Pew Research Center, there are about 15 million Jewish people in the world, representing 0.2% of the 8 billion worldwide population. So we're a very, very small segment of the world population. I think this is important to remember, especially with all these myths about us running the world and like, we're like this, we're a blip on the map, okay? While Jewish people historically have been found all around the globe, the highest concentration of Jewish people are in a couple locales, and those are the locales we'll be talking about today. So more than 4/5 of all Jewish people live in just two countries: the United States, where 41% of Jewish people live, Israel, where 41% of people live, And the largest remaining shares of the global Jewish population are in Canada. So about 3% of the world's global population is in Canada. And then France, UK, so on and so forth. And it's like 2%, 1%, et cetera, to fill in the rest of that statistic. So that's why today we will mostly be talking about Canada, the United States, and Israel. And it's because that's where most of the world's Jewish population is. And I feel it's important to name that because that's not my intention to be like North American centric or Eurocentric or even propagate a kind of like American exceptionalism. It's just based on where we are, where the discourse is happening. Cool. And then I guess my last statistic for you before we jump to the next section, according to 2021 Canadian census results, 393,500 Canadians identify as Jewish. So Jewish folks make up 1.4% of the Canadian population, and most Jewish folks live in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. So I just thought that was interesting. And then, I put some photos in here of some anti-Semitic signs that were circulating around Quebec specifically in the 20th century. So this one says, "Notice, Jews are not wanted here on St. Agatha, so scram while the going is good." And these, like in the caption under this, I found this via the Holocaust Museum in Montreal in their online archives. This was posted all around Quebec, apparently, like posters everywhere. So clear intimidation, right? Like very troubling. This is also put up in front of a business in Quebec, Jews not allowed. Very similar signs we see that are put up in front of various businesses in the United States, folks not wanting Jewish people in their businesses or in their homes or, whatever places, right? Okay. Cool. So let's transition a little bit. We cover the Canadian context. We have a good sense of some of the major myths and tropes that circulate about the Jewish community. Let's turn to the United States and let's talk a little bit about why Black and Jewish relationality is important and why Black and Jewish people entered into an alliance in the first place. Like what was the reason? The catalyst, if you will. So a lot of times the way that I frame my teaching is I'll give you like the mainstream understanding and then the more nuanced, complex understanding. So I'm going to give you the mainstream understanding first of why the Black and Jewish alliance was created and dissolved. So the mainstream recollection goes something like this. Jewish people played a very big role in the civil rights movement, but as they assimilated into whiteness, they became more concerned with blending into white America than aiding other subjugated peoples. And this assimilation into whiteness made the Black community wary of the Jewish community. And that hesitation was further compounded by the extensive American Jewish support for the state of Israel, which was founded in 1948. Ultimately, the two communities found that their aims were diverging, and this led to the quelling of friendly relations between Black and Jewish people in the United States. So in summation, Jewish folks were very involved in the civil rights movement, but they assimilated into whiteness. Then they became very pro-Israel. Black America didn't like that, and the alliance dissolved by the late part of the 20th century. That's the mainstream recollection. I think there's certainly some truth to the story, but like any mainstream recounting, there is a lot of texture that's missing. So I'm gonna add that in. Sprinkle it in, like a little sprinkle me. Okay. So let's start with this. What's considered to be the post-war period? So 1945 to 1980 is the post-war period that we're talking about. So just to like ground us in the moment, 1945 to 1980, this is the end of World War to the start of the Iran-Iraq War. And essentially a post-war period is just an interval of time between wars. So that's what I mean when I say the post-war period. So we're discussing Black and Jewish relationality during this time. Scholars have different takes on why Black and Jewish solidarities began to emerge. So why they happened in the first place during the post-war period. So I'm going to share some of those understandings. According to historian Mark Dollinger, in the 1950s, Jewish people joined the civil rights struggle for three main reasons. Firstly, shared experiences of enslavement. So Jewish folks were enslaved in Egypt, right? Like their escape from enslavement in Egypt is like a canonical part of the Jewish story. And so because they had also experienced enslavement, they resonated with the Black American struggle. Another main reason is feelings of otherness. Even though the way that Jewish folks experienced being on the margins in the United States was not the same as Black people, they had also been othered, excluded from places, seen signs that say no Jews allowed, right? So that shared feeling of not being told that one does not belong. And then lastly, within the Jewish community this sentiment of a collective commitment to justice in the societies around them. So in other words, a commitment to collective liberations, which is actually a very, remains very relevant and contemporary. Even when we think about freedom struggles today, it's all about like solidarity, coalition building, collective freedom. We're all free or none of us are free, right? So that idea is already circulating in this moment. And it's probably when it first started to circulate, and then it kind of trickled down to us and continues to impact our politics. So in other words, while the particulars of Jewish struggles differed from Black American struggles, Jewish people could still empathize because of their own experiences of oppression. So we also see within the Jewish community, major organizations like the American Jewish Council, Anti-Defamation League, and American Jewish Congress heavily advocating for the intergroup relations movement. So essentially the intergroup relations movement was popular during the 1940s and 1950s, and this movement was generally dependent upon the idea that anti-Semitism and all other forms of bigotry were manifestations of the same essential social dilemma. And thus, American Jews were inextricably linked with and dependent upon the realization of full civil rights for all Americans. So this intergroup relations movement is also deeply informing how Jewish folks are understanding their relationship to the Black freedom struggle. Yes, okay. And let's see. One other thing that historians often talk about when it comes to Black and Jewish relationality is that it wasn't one directional. And I really want to like point on this because I think oftentimes the way the relationship is framed is, wow, look at these Jewish people, they're all white or in the process of assimilating into whiteness, and they helped the Black community. They showed up for the Black community, and it was this one directional aid. But in reality, it was deeply reciprocal. These are concurrent and mutual freedom struggles that are being pursued collectively. And so it was not one directional. You have Jewish folks who are fighting religious discrimination legislation, right? On like local and federal levels. You have Black folks who are trying to secure their right to vote without discrimination in the South. Like these are things that are being fought for concurrently, even though the oppressions are different, the struggle is collective. Yes? Okay, amazing. So I want to talk about two kind of famous examples of Black and Jewish solidarity in a US context. I will preface this by saying these are two very masculinist examples, and by that I mean they center men. This is not necessarily reflective of my politics, but rather I feel like in the archives, it's been very difficult to find moments of like solidarity between Black women and Jewish women, for example. And that's not to say it's not there. Sometimes we just aren't in the archive because we get erased or we get left out or our stories aren't told. So just to name that, I'm seeking that. But in the meantime, here are some two like really famous examples of Black and Jewish solidarity that really impacted the public imaginary and social consciousness about the relationship between these two communities. Andrew Goodman. Okay, Andrew Goodman. So at the height of the civil rights movement, Andrew Goodman joined the Freedom Summer of 1964, which its whole point was to register African-American people to vote in the South. At the time, there were a number of discriminatory voting practices like literacy tests, poll taxes, and sheer intimidation at the polls that were barring Black people from exercising their civil liberty to vote. And so that's why they went to Mississippi, they went to the South to disrupt that, to make sure that Black folks were able to get in, able to vote, and not be discriminated against. On his first day in Mississippi, his very first day volunteering for this cause in Mississippi, Andrew Goodman and two other civil rights workers, James Chaney and Michael Schwerner, were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan is a domestic terrorist group in the United States. They were very, active in their heyday, if you will. In the middle to latter half of the 20th century, and they used acts of violence to curtail the Black freedom struggle and other kinds of freedom struggles. So they were murdered by the KKK, and the story of these three young men struck a public chord that contributed to the eventual passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So people were so enraged by these three young men being murdered by this domestic terrorist group that it actually helped to spur the legislation that eliminated discrimination in voting, that gave Black folks in the South specifically unencumbered access to voting. Really, really important. Yeah. I also want to underline that Andrew Goodman was 20, James was 21, Michael was 24, I'm 24, right? Like this is like if I went to Mississippi for the summer to like fight for a cause that I believe in and I just never came back. And I think it's really important to underline that so many of the people who are fighting this fight, who are in this struggle, were very young. Were very, very young and losing their lives senselessly to people who were more dedicated to hate than they were to collective freedoms, more dedicated to upholding racial hierarchies than dismantling them. Okay, so let's talk about another famous example of Black and Jewish relationality, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Rabbi Heschel, again, if you've taken Jewish Studies 101, you know Rabbi Heschel well, or anything akin to that. So Rabbi Heschel was a Jewish theologian. Oh, I guess for context too. So you can see my cursor, right? You see where I'm pointing? Yeah, cool, cool. So this is MLK, of course. This is Rabbi Heschel. Look at his cute little beard, his little glasses. He's so cute. I love him. He's just adorable. I like want to squeeze his little cheeks. Okay. So Rabbi Heschel was a Jewish theologian and philosopher with a social consciousness that led him to participate in the civil rights movement. He's considered, quote, one of the truly great men, end quote, of his day, and a, quote, great prophet, end quote, according to MLK. Those are MLK quotes. Heschel articulated to many Jewish Americans and African Americans the notion that they had a responsibility for each other's liberation, for the plight of all suffering fellow humans around the world. So he was also very dedicated to this notion of like collective freedoms. In March of 1965, Heschel responded to King's call for religious leaders to join the Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights. And that's what this is a picture of. So this is them marching for voting rights in Selma, Montgomery. And the march was very spiritually fulfilling for Heschel. He is known to have said that it felt like his, quote, legs were praying, end quote, as he walked next to King. So they had a very profound relationship. And this is a really important and notable religious alliance, right? Because Jewish folks, we're an ethno-religious group. So one can be ethnically Jewish, one can be religiously Jewish, or one can be both. And of course, then religious alliance, religious affiliation in this struggle was really important. And I think Rabbi Heschel is kind of a prime example of that. So we've covered the good, yay. Like we know why Black and Jewish people came together, shared freedom struggles, they were vibing, like awesome. So what happened? Why is that not where we find ourselves today? Why is that not the situation today? Well, for my research, it's because of the rise of Black power and Zionism and the political discontents that emerge as a result. So let's talk about that. I'll break it down. Like, what do I mean by all these things? The whole shebang. Okay. So towards the end of the post-war period, Black power and Zionism surged simultaneously. And the mainstream argument, again, mainstream contrasted with the nuanced argument. So the mainstream argument, according to historian Mark Dollinger, is that Black power activists bore primary responsibility for the breakup of the Black Jewish coalition in the mid-1960s. He goes on to say that increasingly Black nationalist rhetoric advocated for Black leaders to lead Black movements. And furthermore, the surging Black nationalist ideology was wary of white participation in Black freedom struggles. And consequently, many Jewish people who had previously organized with the Black community during the civil rights movement were ousted. In mainstream approximations, this was a separatist turn in the Black freedom struggle that single-handedly destroyed the Black and Jewish coalition. But as we'll discuss for kind of the next few minutes, the souring of Black and Jewish relationality was definitely not that simple. It wasn't simply, quote unquote, all the Black community's fault. They became separatists and nationalists and kicked all the white people out. That's not really what happened. There were a number of things that happened, political disagreements that led to the dissolution of this alliance. So let's talk about that. So Black and Jewish people did not split in the mid-1960s. It wasn't this clear-cut thing where suddenly Black power is happening, Zionism is happening, and we split. What's happening is a shift in political tactic. So what do I mean by that? We see a shift in freedom struggle tactics from universalism, so this collective freedom, we're all in this together, High School Musical type of thing, to group-based identity politics. So we're going to be a little more granular, a little more insular, think about our particular struggles and target them in that way. By this, I mean a politics that depend on strong identification with one's Blackness and or Jewishness. So for the Jewish American community, this took the form of Zionism and a strong affinity for the newly founded state of Israel, or occupied Palestine, depending on your politics, which was founded in 1948. And for the Black community, this took the form of Black nationalism and a shift in organizing strategies from one that was highly, highly multiracial to being a little more focused on the Black communities, like Black Power, Black is beautiful, thing, Angela Davis and the Afros. That's not to say that the Black Power movement wasn't still deeply multiracial, because it was, but the politics of it, the bent of it, shifted a little bit in this moment, right? We see like the shift from the MLK, like everyone's walking arm in arm, lovey-dovey, which is a collapsing of his legacy, but in terms of the iconography, the imagery, to a little bit more of like a staunchly, unapologetically Black iconography and imagery. In addition, the majority of US Jewish folks saw growing militancy among African-American people as a very similar struggle to their own fight for national power in Israel after an attempted genocide against their people. So you have to remember, like, the Holocaust is 1933 to 1945. The State of Israel was founded in 1948. So this is just years after a horrific, horrific genocide against Jewish folks, right? And so it makes sense that the American Jewish community is rallying behind this locale, is rallying behind this idea anyways. I don't know about the execution, but this idea of having a safe place to call home as a Jewish people after this horrible thing that's happened, after being kicked out and ousted and massacred across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It makes sense. I have tremendous compassion for that, tremendous compassion. However, African-American folks did not necessarily view Zionism with the same kind of affinity that Jewish folks viewed Black nationalism and Black power. So Black America overwhelmingly viewed Israel as an occupying force in Arab lands. And what happened was that what was the Black and Jewish alliance in the 1950s became the Black Arab alliance of the 1960s. So in summation, American Jews see what the Black Power movement is doing. They're like, yeah, this is awesome. This is like what we're doing in Israel. We're trying to carve out a space for ourselves. We're being proudly Jewish and standing in our identity after decades of this process of assimilating into whiteness and shedding our ethnic identities. Jewish folks are like, but Black folks are like, you know what? This is an occupation. We don't rock with this. And we know that we were in alliance with you all, but we don't really support the way that your political trajectory is moving. And so we see this friction, right? This political friction. Oftentimes when historians talk about the dissolution of this alliance, they point to this watershed moment that was the metaphorical straw that broke the camel's back. So in 1967, the Six-Day War, which we'll talk a little bit about, moving in a video like a little later on in the presentation, the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab adversaries took place. And this was a moment where the survival of the Jewish state was called into question. The response from American Jewry was to rally around Israel because the vulnerability of Israel sparked intense anxieties about a second genocide. The idea of Israel no longer existing in 1967 during this issue sparked anxiety about a second genocide. And those anxieties spurred a realization among American Jews that their success in America was dependent on the dissolution of their Jewishness and assimilation into whiteness. In other words, they realized they had forfeited their ethnic identity to survive and succeed in the United States. And that's not a totalizing statement. We'll add a little nuance to that. But for folks who are able to be racialized as white, yes, yes. So the Six-Day War was one of the defining moments of this break between Jewish folks and Black folks. However, there had been tensions long before, right? Like, I think sometimes we point to these moments and we're like, this is what caused it. But there's a buildup. There were already discontents and frictions and fragmentations. Didn't just happen overnight, right? And then this was the watershed moment that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Okay. Onwards, upwards. So this is kind of my last talking at you slide, and then I'm done with kind of the context, and we're going to do more dialogue. So I hope everyone's still with me. We're interested, we're engaged, everything's making sense. Amazing. Wonderful. I appreciate the thumbs up and the camera's on. I appreciate the affirmation. Thank you. All right. Oh, I love talking about this. So Jewish assimilation into whiteness. Jewish assimilation into whiteness, however fraught and incomplete, contributed to the growing tensions between Black and Jewish people, particularly as it related to access to higher education and housing. So Jewish people, unlike their Black counterparts, gained access to housing in all white neighborhoods and eliminated educational quotas during the post-war period. So remember, like when Jewish folks first come to the US, they're not white, they're Jewish, they're other, they're subjugated. And oftentimes they find themselves living in urban spaces and communities with Black folks, like actually literally being in community with Black people, which creates conditions for a certain kind of solidarity. But as white flight happens, and we see all these white folks moving to the suburbs and creating white-only communities that are obviously segregated and only for white people, some Jewish folks anyways, who are racialized as white, are able to gain access to those spaces. And so whereas they were living with and amongst Black people, suddenly we see more Jewish people living with and amongst white people. And this starts to change the social dynamics and landscapes a little bit. In addition to that, higher education, right? So just like in Canada, how there were schools in Quebec that had quotas for how many Jewish people could attend because they wanted to keep those numbers low. Same thing is happening in the United States. The difference is in the United States, Jewish folks are able to enact legislation to bar religious discrimination. And so while there is still a capping of how many Jewish folks can be in school, there's still control around that. More Jewish people are able to gain access to higher education. And as a result, we see that folks are experiencing an upward mobility. We see that Jewish folks are experiencing an upward mobility in the United States that contributes to this division between the Black and Jewish communities. Okay, also we see a decrease in overtly anti-Jewish sentiment during the post-war period, coupled with both the elimination of Jewish quotas and higher professional education and access to housing in suburban white-only neighborhoods. And this facilitated upward mobility for many Jewish folks. Some scholars say that one of the failures of Jewish activist circles is that they did not attend to the question of class. It was all about we're Jewish folks and we also have experienced bad things, and so we have this affinity with the Black community, but there wasn't this attention to the way that Jewish people were ascending in the United States in terms of their class status and how that was creating a particular division with the Black community. Okay. I think we'll move on from there. I think I made my point there. So really my last thing about this section is conditional whiteness. And I made a video on my Instagram and TikTok about this recently. If you have been following the recent content, maybe you've caught it, but conditional whiteness, I think, is really, really key to understanding profoundly this process of Jewish assimilation into whiteness. So let's back up. Jewish people are not the only people who have quote unquote assimilated into whiteness. We think about Italian people, Polish people, Irish people. There's a way in which white folks who possess, a different ethnic identity than white Anglo-Saxon Protestant have been othered in the United States. And then in the latter half of the 20th century, we see these people kind of uneasily assimilate into whiteness. This is conditional in the Jewish community. And the reason is that if there are any visual indications, optical indications that one is Jewish, even if one is optically read as white, racialized as white in the world, then that anti-Semitism can still come to the fore. So for example, if someone is out in the world, they're a Jewish person racialized as white, but they're wearing a kippah, or they have tefillin, or the yarmulke is another name for that covering that people wear on their heads, and they're identified as Jewish, suddenly it's a problem. Suddenly the whiteness is not protecting them anymore, right? And so I think there's this complex conversation that doesn't always happen when people just say, oh, well, all Jews are white, or all Jews assimilated into whiteness. Well, some Jewish people racialized as white, who are able to be racialized as white, may have assimilated into whiteness, yes. And even for those people, it's conditional. But when you make that totalizing statement, all Jews are white, that also erases people like me, right? People who are Black and Jewish, people who are not optically read as white in the world. Because there are Jewish folks who have a darker complexion than mine who they would not be read as white in the world. So what does it mean when we say that all Jewish folks have assimilated into whiteness, all Jewish folks are white? It's both an erasure of those who are not and a collapsing of the conditional nature of that whiteness. Okay, so now we're going to watch a TikTok video. I love this TikToker. She makes the most incredible, well-researched videos. And I think having some visuals to ground us and all the information I just kind of gave to you will be really, really helpful. And then we're going to pause and I'd love to hear your thoughts about the video, your reactions to the video, any questions that you have about everything I just shared. Cool. Cool. I would have embedded this, but it didn't let me embed the video for some reason. All right.
So comedian Dave Chappelle is in hot water for a monologue that he did on SNL that was widely regarded as anti-Semitic. Basketball player Kyrie Irving, who's known to have a proclivity for conspiracy, tweeted a link to a film that contained anti-Semitic disinformation and was eventually suspended by the Nets. And we all know what Kanye is up to. I recently did a video on Black writer Eric Monte's accusations that Norman Lear had cheated him out of the profits of several of the shows that he had had a hand in creating. The torrent of anti-Semitic comments under that video left me reeling. So where is all this coming from? Jewish people were at the vanguard of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. So what happened to relations between the Black and Jewish communities? I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is the breakdown. Now, I want to first acknowledge that it is possible to be both Black and Jewish, since Judaism is a religion, and like Blackness, being Jewish is also a cultural marker. But for the purposes of this conversation, we'll focus on Jewish people who identify as white. Historically, Black and Jewish people have been natural allies. There is a common history of extreme persecution and triumph in the midst of adversity. And for a while, these commonalities seem to create a natural alliance between the two groups. In the world of arts and entertainment, Black and Jewish people have collaborated to create some of the most significant and lasting works of all time. And it's safe to say that the world of comedy would essentially be non-existent without the contributions of Black and Jewish people. Historically, Jewish people in America have been politically progressive, and they were some of the first to break down racial barriers. During the initiative to register Black voters in Mississippi in 1964, which came to be known as Freedom Summer, more than half of the lawyers that represented those civil rights workers were Jewish. 2 Jewish workers, along with a Black man, were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for their participation in that movement. But there's a general feeling that relations between the two groups began to sour in the late 1960s. Many hold the Black nationalist movement responsible for this shift. Leaders within the Nation of Islam, in particular, espoused explicitly anti-Semitic views and promoted very dangerous ideologies around the origin of the Jewish people in America and the threat that they represented to Black people. This anti-Jewish fervor within a certain segment of the Black community is seen by many as the beginning of the end of the Black and Jewish alliance. But there's more to the story than that. When Jewish people began to migrate en masse to the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they, like Polish and Irish immigrants, weren't seen as white in the US. That was a designation that was strictly reserved for Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But right around the middle of the 20th century, America extended an uneasy ceasefire and effectively granted them whiteness. Whiteness with an asterisk, but whiteness nonetheless. Since race as we know it is a social construct and not a biological reality, yeah, they could do that. And so Black people who could not change their names or features and be absorbed into the general population began to find allyship elsewhere. The shifting political tides contributed greatly to this as well. Rather than being seen as struggling minorities fleeing persecution, the Jewish people were now representatives of the American dream. They were an immigrant success story. But by the late 1960s, the United States, and specifically the Black community, was becoming more aware of the Palestinian struggle. It was only a matter of time before the Nation of Islam began to loudly assert that Jewish people in America were complicit in the oppression of Palestinians. And Black folks identified with that struggle. Now, there are 2 realities that we need to be able to hold simultaneously. Number 1, the Jewish people belong to an historically marginalized group that has been systematically persecuted for simply existing for thousands of years. And number 2, for the last 70 years, Jewish people have been a part of the dominant racial caste in the US, and therefore are able to participate in and perpetuate white supremacy. It would stand to reason that Black entertainers in particular would be acutely aware of the history of exploitation of Black art and artists by unscrupulous managers, agents, and industry heads. That's a history that can't be explained away. But in our zeal to call out white supremacy in all of its forms, we as Black people must remember that religious and cultural persecution are tools of the oppressor. We cannot find true liberation in allowing ourselves to become the mouthpiece for someone else's holy war. Our fight isn't against Jewishness, it's against white supremacy. And the paradox is that that has historically been a shared battle between the Black and Jewish communities. Join Greg Bryant and I for...
I love that last part. I feel like it's so powerful, right? Our fight is not against Jewishness, it's against white supremacy, which some Jewish people racialized as white can be complicit in and further. But that's the project. The project is white supremacy. That's what we're fighting against, not particular people or particular identities. So now I'm going to stop talking for just a little bit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, reactions, questions. And yeah, let's chop it up. What did you think about that video? What were your kind of initial reactions or sentiments? Yeah, just feel free to unmute, just jump in.
So can I jump in if that's okay? I actually posted a question in the chat, and I'm not sure if it makes entire sense, but one of my questions was about when we're talking about the split between the Black and Jewish sort of alliance that had been so prominent. To what degree is this sort of naturally occurring splits that occurred based on, you know, factors around Israel, Palestine, things like that? And to what degree do we actually have to really think about the role that the white supremacist institutions, the FBI, the CIA, all of those institutions actually like used whatever these natural fissures may be to their own ends? And like, so what degree did these institutions further cause the split or further exacerbate the split? And like how, yeah, I guess like just what are your thoughts on how those institutions sort of maybe saw something happening and went, haha, now's our time to really break down a collective movement and let's use this to our advantage? So that was sort of just my thought, if you have any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. I think this is a both and situation, right? Like, as you named, maybe some natural political, ideological fissures that emerged. That's real. But then we see part of the tools of white supremacy is to take those moments and to weaponize them to further drive wedges between communities that would otherwise perhaps be allied or be working with one another. So absolutely, the FBI, CIA, like sending spies into these different spaces, like planting rumors, like misinformation. I don't know, like the idea that the entire Black community was suddenly anti-Semitic because of the rise of Islam, like all this misinformation being circulated, right? Very, very intentional. And I think this is part of the core praxis of white supremacy. And I don't think that it's even just unique to the relationship between the Black and Jewish community. Even if we think about the dialectic between the Black community and the Asian community, this positing, this mythology, again, mythologies are so powerful, this positing of Black people as the problem minority and Asian people as the mono minority. These are mythologies, these are myths, these are not truths, but they're used to turn communities, again, that would otherwise perhaps have something in common, a fight against white supremacy, against one another, to see one another as the problem as opposed to white supremacy as the problem. So I hope that kind of answers your question. I'd be happy to kind of, after the presentation, share more specific stuff on the FBI and CIA.
No, that's really great. It really, as we think about how to tackle some of these issues writ large in the work that we do, it really reinforces that what we're really looking at is, you know, the structures that have been put in place are as like, that's where the focus needs to be ultimately, is that, you know, like, it's not, this isn't personal responsibility to solve these problems. This is systemic issues that have created these problems, and they will not fundamentally be changed without systemic change, because those systems are so invested in continuing the white supremacy that we see today. I guess is just my thinking, is like, I'm just trying to puzzle through that a little bit more. Anyway, thank you.
Absolutely. No, I so appreciate that. And I think that's important, because oftentimes when we think about these sorts of social woes, people will chalk it up to, oh, well, that's just a bad person or a bad egg. Or even when people talk about like the police in the United States, it's just one bad cop. No, it's an institutional problem. It's not just one bad cop. It's that this institution was created literally to be a slave patrol, like to disallow people running to freedom, like that is, and to protect white property. Like that is the core of the institution, and it continues to perform that kind of work. So absolutely, the shift from the personal, the individual, to the institutional, super key. Thank you for that. Other thoughts or questions or reactions to the video?
I wanted to see if anyone else has any questions. I'm not sure if you're going to expand on this or want to chat about it after, but let's see how I can formulate this into a question. Something that's like really been on my mind, especially like in some of the work that we've been doing with a client, and then I live in a dominant Jewish community in Toronto, is when you talked about conditional whiteness. And I remember like I saved your video a while back on this topic, primarily because of we do a lot of training and education on race and racism, and some comments being received of frustrations within some Jewish folks and audiences feeling as though our current conception of race and racialization is incompatible with the ways in which Jewish people are experiencing racism and these like color hierarchies, and feeling as though being Jewish is a race itself, and like that debates that are occurring from my research within the community. And so basically like I'm trying to think about new ways and shifting ways on like how we educate on racism to be more inclusive of that narrative and to not erase. And because again, from like trying to be more informed, is like to erase the idea of the racialization of Jewish people is anti-Semitic, and to try to make sure that we are in our definitions of racism and conversation of racism encompasses that experience, especially in Toronto. I just know like this is just so present here when I'm doing a lot of our training here. So I just wondering if you had any advice about engaging in that conversation and approaching education in that way. Anything at all?
Oh, what an excellent question. Excellent question. I mean, I think even the fact that you're using the language of racialization now to talk about the experiences of Jewish people, like underlining in a conversation of race, we're talking about racism or othering, that Jewish people have been racialized differently across time and space, and holding all of that nuance. I think even just that in the conversation of racism is really, really important. Like walking us through Jewish folks in Nazi Germany, the justification of why that Nazi Germany thought it was okay to extinguish them was because they were viewed as an impure, undesirable race, one that would not serve the nation state, that literally needed to be extinguished from the face of the earth. And so, yes, they were understood or orchestrated as a racial other, as an undesirable racialized people. But then you have Jewish folks immigrating to the United States. They remained in that space for a long time because of this eugenics, like pseudoscientific exchange between Germany as well as the United States. But then we do see this uneasy assimilation into whiteness. So how do we hold that too? I think it can be both and. Like there's been this differential racialization across time and space. And at the same time, for Jewish folks who are racialized as white, they can and often do experience a great deal of privilege and can participate and uphold white supremacy, ironically, even though white supremacy is deeply dependent on anti-Semitism, right? So even though that whiteness is conditional, they can still be a part of the problem. And I often find, in my conversations within the Jewish community, I found myself getting frustrated as a Black Jew, talking to Jewish folks and like, oh, well, I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And I'm like, well, like I hear what you're saying. And in that kind of sentiment, that kind of statement, you're denying the very real privilege that you do inhabit moving through the world. Again, unless you're wearing some kind of religious garb or you're in a Jewish religious space. So I think my best answer to you, that's kind of a long way of saying, my best answer is that holding space for the historical trajectory of how Jewish folks have been racialized differently across time and space, and like concurrently holding space for the fact that there is a privilege that Jews racialized as white possess, even though that privilege is conditional. Naming that out really clearly, spelling it out clearly, I think is quite powerful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was an awesome question. Really appreciate you. Thank you. Anything else? No pressure. Just want to create space. All right. Oh, we got another thing. Let's see. I have some drilling going on upstairs. Oh, we got drilling going on. Okay. But was wondering if you've seen any spaces / communities / cities in the States or elsewhere where Black and Jewish communities are again acting in solidarity. We see the mainstream narrative, especially across the US, but wondering if there are regional and or nuanced actions / approaches that are starting to work again. Oh, what an interesting question. I guess I'll speak more from my personal experience as a Black and Jewish person who's very much in Black and Jewish spaces and organizing leftist spaces in Chicago. So I'm in Chicago, Illinois, Midwestern girly over here. I moved here semi-recently, like I've only been here about a year and a half, but I've really done my best to immerse myself in community. What I'm noticing now is that there is a lot of pioneering work happening in the Jew of color space, if you will. Not everyone likes that terminology, kind of like people of color, right? There are like mixed feelings about it, what that word is doing, what kind of political work it's doing or not doing. But there's a lot of work happening in the Jew of color space. So what I've noticed is that a lot of organizations are creating subsidiaries or groups in their organizations specifically for Jews of color. So safe spaces for Jews of color. For example, there's this one Chicago organization called JCUA, so the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, like very leftist Jewish space. And they have this subsidiary under their main thing called COL-OR-JOCC, so Jews of Color Coalition, essentially. I've attended some of their events. It's really cool. I think there's this move in Jewish spaces to more intentionally center and uplift Jews of color, folks who are otherwise pushed to the margins because of something called Ashkenormativity, which we'll talk a little bit more about later in our chat today. But I think that's some of the work that I'm seeing being done, intentionally carving out spaces for Jews of color, pulling voices from the margins to the center, and trying to more intentionally like organize with the Black community. So for example, like I also went to a training a couple of months ago about anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And there was a whole like undercurrent of that conversation, which was, we want to be in Black organizing spaces. We don't want to like overwhelm those spaces, but we want to be in those spaces. We also need to make sure that those spaces are accommodating to us though. Like, so maybe not having a meeting on Shabbat, like maybe let's not do a Friday night meeting. Sorry, I've got some, see, now I've got noise in my background. it's spreading. But you know, how can we create organizing spaces that are also religiously sensitive? I think that's some of the discourse that's happening. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's sort of like what comes to mind for me. Anything else? Again, no pressure, just creating space. Cool, cool. Amazing. I'm glad that's helpful. So let's return to our little presentation. Put it back and present. Come on, you got it. Oh, it took us all the way back to the beginning. Why? Okay, sorry, bear with me. Okay, it keeps doing that. We're just gonna scroll through. Gonna roll bounce. So now we're gonna shift a little bit and talk about Israel and Palestine. And after that, we'll kind of dive more into terminology, language. I want to hear more from you, diversity in the Jewish community, and then our exercise. We're kind of closing with the exercise because I want us all to have as much information as humanly possible to arrive at the work with, if that makes sense. Amazing. So I will reiterate, as we dive into a discussion of Israel and Palestine, I know this is a very, very sensitive subject matter. I want to underline very clearly, my intention is not to push a pro anything. Of course, I have my own political, ideological stance on this, but I'm not trying to tell you to be pro anything. I'm trying to add nuance to the conversation. And I'm, including this quote from April Rosenblum, who is a really amazing Jewish scholar. I love her work. And this is in her piece, kind of like a Zine, and it's called The Past Didn't Go Anywhere, very much circulating in like leftist Jewish spaces. Anyways, she says, it's virtually impossible to speak out critically about Israel without being charged with anti-Semitism. And I want to dwell on this for a moment because I think there's a lot of truth to this. I think oftentimes when it comes to Israel and Palestine, we're frightened to have the conversation because folks don't want to be wrong or folks don't want to be accused of being charged with anti-Semitism. And I just want to say for this space, I think it is perfectly acceptable to be critical of the Israeli government, and it is possible to do so without being anti-Semitic. It is also possible to be critical of the Israeli government while also being anti-Semitic. Both things are possible. So just want to name all of that up front before we dive into the content. Cool, cool. So this is kind of an older video. This came out about 7 years ago. So of course, there's been a lot more that's happened since then. This is probably one of the most, if anything can be neutral about the situation, like what does that even mean to be neutral? The personal is political, right? But if I were to say that this is a neutral, this is probably one of the more neutral videos I've found about what's happening in Israel and Palestine. You can tell it's a little dated though, because it says Israel-Palestine conflict. Even that terminology has come under question, right? So the idea of it being a conflict versus it being an occupation, those are two different things. So I just wanted to name that. But we're going to give this a watch, and we are actually going to watch the whole thing. I normally don't watch videos this long, but I think it's so, so helpful. And then I'm going to do my thing and add some scaffolding and nuance, and we'll talk more about it, okay?
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries. all about
you
ancient
hear
religious
okay?
hatreds. In fact,
Be
while
loud.
religion is involved,
Oh, oi. Oh, there it is. My first oi of the presentation. I knew it was
one of the
coming.
biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land. And it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling in farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states, one for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. But the Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war.
This was the
When it
straw
ended,
that broke the camel's
Israel
back.
had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them. The growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the first Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. But this violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right. The country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just to manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence. The most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
All right, let's take like a collective inhale and exhale, shall we? I feel like this is a really heavy topic. I like felt that. So let's inhale. Exhale. Okay, I love breath work, so it's okay if folks aren't into that, but I feel like it's really helpful. So that was a lot. Do we feel like that gave us a clear sense of the geopolitical situation in the Middle East? Was this at all helpful, new information for anyone? Yeah, okay, good. So let's add some nuance. You know, that's my thing. I feel like if there was a buzzword to describe me, it would be nuance. All right, let's add some nuance. So here are the facts. Israel's home to 41% of the world's Jewish population, right? That's a lot of the world's Jewish population that is in Israel. Many Jews, not racialized as white, have also found homes there and found reprieve from persecution. So Ethiopian Jews, many Mizrahi Jews, even Sephardic Jews have fled persecution in their own homes, right? To move to Israel and find like reprieve and safety there. So I feel like that's really important to note. I also think that the way that Israel is normally framed as it relates to Palestine is in this very US-centric black-white binary. So here is Israel, this white nation, this settler colonial nation. They're white, they're backed by all these Western powers, all these white people, and then here are all these brown people that they're pushing out and like turning into refugees. This is a white-black conflict. And I want to add a little more texture to that because I don't think that's actually reflective of what's happening in that region of the world. And I think that collapses the complexity of what a potential remedy or solution could be or could look like. So we have Ethiopian Jews, we have Mizrahi Jews, we have Chinese Jews, we have Indian Jews, we have Jews. It's a diaspora, right? Like we disperse from a central place all around the world. So Jewish folks are racialized and identify differently and arrive to Israel with a whole modicum of identities. This is not a white nation. If there's one thing that you take away, I want you to know this is not a white nation. Are there Jewish people racialized as white in this nation? Absolutely, but this is not a white nation, okay? At the same time, folks who are racialized as Black, such as Ethiopian Jews, for example, do receive poorer treatment and experience discrimination in Israel. Anti-Black racism is alive and well in Israel. Ethiopian Jews often describe their experience as feeling like second-class citizens in this land. So even though many Ethiopian Jews are first or second generation refugees in this space, they exist because they fled Ethiopia and found themselves in Israel, and that's how they're able to persist. They still experience anti-Black racism in this space. So what do we do with that, right? Like that's very complex. At the same time, there are also Black and brown Jews who identify as Zionists. So what is a Zionist? Are we familiar with that term? Have we heard that term before today's conversation? Yeah, kind of, sort of. Does anyone have like a definition of Zionism that they'd like to share with their group? No wrong answers. I'm just curious where folks are at. If not, I can throw mine out there. All right, I will throw mine out there. So Zionism, to my understanding, is a nationalist movement that claims that Jewish people deserve to have their own nation, their own state, and that should be located in the land of Israel, that is the home and the land of the Jewish people. That being said, Zionism is not a monolith. There are people who are secular who are Zionists. There are people who are very far right who are Zionists, who are very far left who are Zionists, who are very religious who are Zionists, very observant, etc. Yeah, please go ahead. Just jump in.
I was just curious. Oh, no, now I know. It's like fleeing my head. Oh God. I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the question back now. Okay, maybe I'll just type it in the chat if it comes back. I'm so sorry.
No, you're totally fine. No worries. I know that exact feeling. It like comes to you and then it leaves you just that quickly. If you remember it, just jump back in or put it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. So we also have Black and brown Jews who are experiencing subjugation in Israel via anti-Black racism, but many of these people are refugees in this land, so depend on this land to exist. And many of these people are also Zionists. So you see what I mean? Like this is not a white and Black conflict. This is deeply, deeply complex, and there are layers to this. Now, I said this earlier in the presentation, I'll say it again. I really, really have tremendous compassion for Jewish folks, for my community, and desiring a safe place to call home after thousands of years of persecution. Like, I feel that deeply, intimately in my soul and my spirit. I get it. Like, who could blame them, right? Who could blame them? Who could blame us for desiring that? Well, I won't say us, them for desiring that, right? At the same time, I guess this is me showing my personal politics a little bit. I don't think that it's okay to secure your own safety by just allowing that very thing for other subjugated peoples. And so I definitely have very, very, very strong critiques of the Israeli government. And I think it's okay to have those critiques. They don't make me anti-Semitic, right? It just makes me a critical, thoughtful person. And I encourage you to feel free and feel empowered to do the same. Last few things that I want to say about Israel and Palestine before we kind of move on to a different part of the presentation. I also want to make sure I leave room for our activity. So we might expedite a few little things here at the end. See, I always think I have so much time, and then I just start talking and I love this topic and I just keep going. So, I will say that the Zionist movement has absolutely included elements of racism from its early days, such as the claim that Palestine was, quote, a land without a people for a people without a land. That's not true. Palestine was not a land without a people. There were absolutely people there who are now refugees in like surrounding countries around this space, right? So what do we do with that? Like, there are absolutely racist ideological undercurrents to Zionism. However, people choose to identify or not identify with those undercurrents. And so as a whole, I think it's safe to say that Zionism has had racist and oppressive results for the Palestinian people. But then again, as we noted, it's not monolithic. And I just encourage us, like, we could talk about this for probably 24 hours. Like, we could do a whole course on this, right? So this is really just an introduction to Israel and Palestine. But I do think it's really hard to talk about Black and Jewish relationality, to talk about Jewish community without touching on this topic, because so much of the world's Jewish population is in Israel, and because so many Jewish people in the United States and in Canada very, very highly identify with the state of Israel and support the existence of the state of Israel. It's a flashpoint. Like, it's so hard to talk about Jewish identity without discussing this. And I hope this gives you like maybe some tools to better understand what's happening in that part of the world, to better understand how complex, how deeply complex it is, and also to understand why this Black and white racialized binary just isn't productive when we talk about this, because it's not accurate. It doesn't reflect the composition of Israel and Palestine. Okay, I see something in the chat. Well, let's see. Is Zionism linked to Jerusalem specifically as a holy city, and as that relating to why specifically they occupy that geographical region? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this idea that this is like the holy land of, this is not just a holy land for Jewish people, but the idea that this is Jerusalem is specifically the holy land of the Jewish people. Absolutely. There is specificity to the locale. Great question. Thank you for that. I'm glad I came back to you. Okay. So I was going to ask for like a call and response type of thing with this, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of run through some terminology very briefly with you here, just to make sure we're on the same page about that. And then we're going to talk about what we mean when we say diversity in the Jewish community, because I want to leave time for that activity. Okay. Amazing. So I think these are some really key terms to have a strong grounding in when we're talking about Black and Jewish relationality. We have to understand what these things mean. So let's start with white supremacy. White supremacy, based on the definition that I have come to, is defined as the belief that white people are a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. So white supremacy normalizes a racial hierarchy. It supposes that a racial hierarchy is in fact an infallible and immutable truth, that white people are a superior race and everyone else falls somewhere along the continuum. White nationalism, I'm jumping around a little. White nationalism is a political ideology which espouses the belief that white people are a race and seeks to develop and maintain a white racial and national identity. Many of its proponents identify with and are attached to the concept of a white nation or a white ethno-state. So the distinction here with white nationalism is that it's about the nation state, making sure that white people specifically remain the most populated and the most central and power-oriented people within a nation state. So we see that as it's manifested in Nazi Germany, this idea of like the Aryan race, right? Like, we don't want people who are not Aryan, because these are the folks that we want to populate the nation state. These are the desirable people to exist, and everyone else, not so much. And so we're going to take horrible genocidal action to ensure that, right? So white nationalism. Okay. Anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish oppression. Feels weird to introduce this at this part of the presentation, but I don't know. I feel like I want to allow people to arrive at the definitions they have and then to share mine like as you're also coming to your own consciousness. I don't want to interject my definitions too soon type of thing. So that's why I'm introducing it at this part. It might feel a little funky, but that's the rationale. So the reason that I have anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish oppression in here is because there's a very interesting history to anti-Semitism. I'll delve into that in a minute. But the definition of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish oppression is the system of ideas passed down through a society's institutions to enable scapegoating of Jews and the ideological or physical targeting of Jews that result from that. So a particular subjugation and oppression that targets Jewish folks by scapegoating them, by blaming them for all the woes of the world. They're dominating the world. They're controlling everything. Everything is their fault. And this is the methodology we're going to use to justify being anti-Semitic, right? Like that's the grounding. The scapegoating is really, really key to understanding how anti-Jewish oppression works. Now, anti-Semitism has a very interesting history because it was actually popularized in 1879 by someone who is not a quote unquote Semite. So someone who is not Jewish and someone who is not Arab. Pause there. Do we know what a Semite is? Raise of hands. Like if you know what a Semite is. Yeah, we don't know. See, I feel like most people don't know. It's really interesting. It's really, really interesting. So let's start there. What is a Semite? What does it mean to be an anti-Semite, to be anti-Semitic, right? A Semite is someone who speaks a Semitic language, which happens to be Jewish folks, Arab folks, and Muslim folks. But that often gets obfuscated with this term because when we think about anti-Semitism, like you think about Jewish people, right? You're not thinking about Arab people, you're not thinking about Muslim people. So it's very interesting, and there's a reason for this. So as I was saying, in 1879, the term anti-Semitism was popularized by someone who is neither Arab, nor Muslim, nor Jewish, and his name is William Marr. From the beginning, he chose this term as a chic new scientific word to show that Jewish people were an inferior race, but not a religion that they can convert out of. So this is an important distinction. Anti-Semitism notes that Jewish people are an inferior race, not an undesirable religion. Like there is a racialization to the way that anti-Semitism is functioning and working as a tool, right? And this term was created, anti-Semitism was created to replace the word Jew hatred, or in German, Judenhass, because this term had kind of fallen out of vogue, was seen as very crass, and anti-Semitism was seen as more sophisticated. So this term was invented by someone who did not like Jewish people had to have a more sophisticated, chic way of talking about how much he hated Jewish people, which is wild because the Jewish community has absolutely taken up this term and used it to describe our own experiences in subjugation, which is valid, but it's actually not a super accurate term, and it actually comes from a really harmful source. So it's really fascinating. I see we have another question. Is Zionism linked to, oh yes, okay, we already covered that. Sorry, it didn't like register as having been read. Cool. So that's anti-Semitism. The reason that I also put anti-Jewish oppression in here is because April Rosenblum has this really interesting kind of shift in language that she uses, where she says, you know, anti-Semitism, because of its origins and because of the fact that it doesn't just refer to Jewish people, it's actually not a very accurate term. And so anti-Jewish oppression is the more precise terminology to use when we're talking about the subjugation Jewish folks experience. So I just want to offer that. I don't know that that's very commonplace or widely circulated, but I read a lot. So this is what I've encountered. So anti-Jewish oppression, I think that's really interesting. That's definitely a term that I use sometimes, but I still feel that anti-Semitism is the more widely used terminology. And then very lastly, but certainly not least, anti-Black racism, right? So anti-Black racism underlines the particular experience of discrimination and othering that Black people go through by virtue of racialized notions of inferiority. So I feel like there's more understanding of what anti-Black racism is, because that's been more in the public discourse, at least to my understanding. So that's why I'm scaffolding out the Jewish stuff more, because people don't necessarily take anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish oppression very seriously. And I think it's important to stake a claim as to why it matters. All right. Oh, I have this video. I don't think I'm going to show it. One, it's a lot. Maybe I'll share it with you afterwards. And like, if you feel like this is something you want to engage with, you can do so. Essentially, it's about everything that happened in Charlottesville in 2017, like the white nationalist neo-Nazi uprising in Charlottesville. And it's really fascinating. It's kind of like an expose of this white nationalist group and their ideologies. think it provides great insights, but I'll share it with Marcy and you can watch this later if you want to, because it is a lot. All right. We're going to talk about diversity a little bit, and then I think we'll close with the activity. Yeah, let's do that. Sorry, I like to think out loud. I hope that's okay. I'm going with the flow here. So diversity of the Jewish community. What do we mean when we say that? Well, I've made this beautiful little list for you that is barely the tip of the iceberg of what diversity in the Jewish community looks like. I mean, this is also to some extent collapsed, but people have different definitions sometimes of what it means to be Mizrahi, what it means to be Sephardic. So I'm not saying these are immutable, like absolute truths, but from my research, from my approximation, these are very accurate and reliable. So Mizrahi Jews, often approximated as Middle Eastern Jews, so a part of the Jewish diaspora that stayed in or oriented around the Middle East. Ashkenazi Jews, so Ashkenazi Jews, part of the diaspora who arrived in Europe, found themselves in Europe for a long period of time. So when I say all these places, it's not that that Jewish folks come from these places, it's that diasporically they've arrived to these places and regions. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. So Mizrahi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, mostly located in Spain and Portugal. Abayu Daya Jews, so mostly in Eastern Uganda, which is so cool. I feel like people don't realize that there are absolutely Jewish populations on the continent of Africa. Really, really fascinating. And across the diaspora, people's kind of practices and like all kinds of things really vary. It's truly, truly fascinating. Multiracial Jews like myself, right? So my dad is Ashkenazi, my mom is Black. Technically in a US context, I'm like multiracial or biracial or mixed or whatever language folks choose to use. But there are absolutely other multiracial Jews like myself who have all kinds of different ways of arriving at their identity. Kaifeng Jews. So this is a very little known Jewish population that's located in China. There's about, I want to say like 1,000 Kaifeng Jewish folks who are still like identifying strongly with their Jewish identity. Some folks have made aliyah to Israel, which is essentially when you quote unquote return to the land of Israel. And that's another community. Cochin Jews, so a Jewish population that's in India. How cool is that? Igbo Jews, so Jewish folks who are Nigerian in origin, like, and so many more. This is barely the tip of the iceberg. I wanted to take the time to go through all these individually to really truly underline the Jewish community is not all racialized as white. Like, we all arrive to our identity in so many different ways, and we need to hold space for that. It's so important. Okay, this is a little bit self-aggrandizing, but I'm going to show you some of my TikToks now. So hope you won't hold it against me. All right. So this I already did the work of creating this really succinct explanation, so I thought I'd just share it. This is kind of an explanation of the historical origins of Kaifeng Jews so that you can, again, have more visuals to ground into all the stuff that I'm telling you.
Did you know that there are Chinese Jewish people in China and they're called Kaifeng Jews? Let me explain. Hi, my name is Raven. I'm Black and Jewish. I educate on diversity in the Jewish community. Those scholars would agree on exactly when they started to arrive, either during the Tang or Song dynasty. Jewish folks from India or Persia, present-day Iran, began to trade along the Silk Road. Many of these people settled in Kaifeng, a city in China's Henan province. Kaifeng's first synagogue was built in this year, but was destroyed by a flood by this year. Over the next 400 years, there was a fire, another flood, and then one more flood in the 1860s that wiped out Kaifeng's last synagogue. It was also around this time that the community's last religious leader passed away. Building and rebuilding a synagogue so close to the Yellow River maybe wasn't the best idea. Hindsight's 2020, right? Kaifeng Jews prayed in both Hebrew and Chinese, which is so cool. And at their most populous, the Kaifeng community had about 5,000 members. Due to intermarriage with Han-Chinese people, folks from different religious backgrounds, and a whole host of assimilation tactics, the Jewish Kaifeng community gradually declined. Today, there are about 1,000 Kaifeng Jewish people in China. Their Jewish heritage deserves to be recognized, celebrated, and validated. L'chaim. Did you know that there are Chinese?
So raise a hand. How many people had literally ever heard of like Kaifeng Jewish folks? Not a single hand, right? Because we don't talk about this. Everything is so Ashken normative. And that brings me to kind of this next video. Look at that segue. Look at me go. About Ashken normativity. And I explain it, so I guess I'll just explain it.
What is Ashken normativity? Why should you care about it? It's the centering of Ashkenazi Jews racialized as white within conversations around the Jewish community. Byproduct of which is that Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Ethiopian Jews, biracial and multiracial Jews like myself feel like we're at the margins of Jewish discourses. And this matters because the Jewish community is immensely diverse, but when we play into this narrative of Ashken normativity, we erase those who don't fit that mold. What is Ashken normativity? Why should you?
So in summation, because that was really fast. I have to talk fast with the TikTok algorithm because people do not have like any attention span to watch a long video. It's not there. In summation, Ashkenormativity is the centering of Ashkenazi Jews racialized as white within discourses around the Jewish community. I think this is particularly pronounced in US context. I don't know as much in context of Israel because there is a much more diverse array of Jews in Israel versus in the United States. The majority of the Jewish folks here are Ashkenazi. I want to say about 67%, according to recent Pew research, are Ashkenazi. So there is a way that the experiences and cultural practices of Ashkenazi Jews get centered. And sometimes this does push folks who are not Ashkenazi and or not racialized as white to the margins of conversations and discourses. And also it allows people to make the presumption or make the claim that all Jews are white, right? So that there is a way that Ashkenormativity is doing a kind of a very destructive work, and that I think we need to call attention to and actively disrupt. So hopefully this gives you a better sense of how beautiful and diverse the Jewish community is. Like I love my community. I feel like this is one of my favorite things about being Jewish, like getting to celebrate this, getting to convene with like other Jews of color and like hear about different people's like lineages and backgrounds and heritages and traditions, right? Because we are not a monolith by any means. And I hope more people understand that so that we can't make these kinds of claims that all Jews are white, because it's just not accurate. I'll share this with you as well. It's an awesome video, kind of just extrapolating on what I've just shared with you, but in the interest of time, we'll carry on. We're not going to talk about Kanye because I want us to get to the activity, and this is going to take a little bit of time. And this is how we'll kind of close out our time together today. So I'm excited for us to take all this good stuff we've been talking about and put it to work. So essentially this activity, I'm going to break you into groups of about 2 or 3. Let's see, we have 9 folks. Okay, so 3 people in each group then. Is that including me? I think that's including me. Yeah, so then we'll do 4 groups of 2. I mean, can you tell I'm in the humanities? I had to think about that. I was like, 4 times 2, is that 8? Yes. So we'll do 4 groups of 2. And these 3 scenarios, I personally thought of these, crafted these. And what I want you to do is get through as many scenarios as you can, but pick at least one scenario as a duo, read through it, and discuss amongst yourselves what would be the best way to handle this situation. All 3 of these scenarios are workplace dilemmas that pertain to anti-Semitism, Jewish identity, and mythology, and misinformation. And all of it kind of ties into what we've been discussing. So I'm going to do my best to create breakout rooms. I'm trying to think. I'll place these in the chat so that when you go to the breakout group, you still have access to them. So stand by. Let me pull them up. Or maybe, yeah, I'll put it in the chat, but maybe in the meantime, did everyone see them or should I share again?
Maybe just throw that back up and we can just take a screenshot or a picture or something.
Yeah, I can plunk it in. I took a photo because I was worried about not seeing it, so I'll just put it in the chat.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Okay, let me pull it back up. See, now I've changed my whole little setup. Okay. Here we go, share screen. Okay, yes, so maybe take a little screenshot real quick, and then I will break you off into groups and you'll discuss. Any questions? Is that like the directions are clear? We know what we're doing? Wonderful, fabulous. Okay, breakout rooms. We're gonna do 4 breakout rooms. Assign automatically, include co-hosts. No, we'll take us out. Okay, fabulous. Well, if we're both out, then that's 7. Oh Lord. Okay, we'll include us. Okay, here we go. Open all rooms. Should be able to join now. Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna join one.
Fabulous.
Yay.
Folks are trickling back in. We'll give people a few more seconds. Welcome back to the group. So we have good breakouts, good individual combos, those generative. Yeah, amazing. So with these last 6 minutes or so, I'd love to just kind of hear your insights. Maybe we can go through scenario 1, 2, 3. If folks want to share out like some ways that you would handle this situation, what went wrong in this situation, and then we'll kind of close out our time together. And just feel free to jump in. I don't really do hand raising, just jump in. So scenario 1, let's start there.
But in our group, we talked about for scenario 1 specifically, first of all, switching from calling it a Christmas party to calling it a holiday party or end of year party, specifically with the acknowledgement that not all people are Christian or celebrate that holiday. So that's the first thing. Second, in advance to having any of this happen, and to like ensure that you're following inclusive practices, to ensure that you are aware of everyone's dietary restrictions. So whether that be religious focused or allergies or whatever the case is, similar to how you would ask if folks have allergies, you ask if they have any other restrictions as well, so that in instances like this, Josh wouldn't have to miss out on the entire event and the team building and everything else that goes on because he wasn't considered.
Fabulous. I couldn't have said it better myself. That was amazing, Destiny. Thank you. The group nailed it. Fabulous, fabulous. Any other things to add to scenario 1? I feel like that was it. Other thoughts?
The only other thing we talked about was also like if this had happened and we couldn't like course correct in advance, so this is now a thing that's happened, is actually having a conversation with Josh to, and again, this came up through a few of our scenarios of like not taking away someone's own agency. So having that conversation before we interject in these situations so that we're still providing like the opportunity for, Josh may be perfectly fine having a conversation after the fact with his managers and being like, yeah, that wasn't cool. We don't need to take that agency away from them. But also by giving some agency back, also saying like, hey, maybe talk to Josh. There's probably some great kosher catering options that you can actually consider. Like include people in the planning development that are themselves representative of diverse identities, so that this isn't a situation that goes forward in the first place, kind of thing.
Excellent. No, that's so smart. Like crowdsourcing information about what best practices would be, not necessarily asking those folks to like do the labor of making it happen, but to inquire as to what would best serve them and like their needs. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Let's move on to scenario 2. Any thoughts on how to handle this situation?
I know.
Come on, y'all. We can't be like the people in our training sessions.
I heard brilliant. Jump in. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Yeah, in our group, we talked about, like if we were a colleague that had overheard this or something, we could talk to Sam afterwards, and just like Heather said before in the example, kind of like giving Sam some agency about how she feels comfortable moving forward. And if that's like her going to the coworker or you going together, or even you saying it and being like standing up for her if that's what like she doesn't want to, but still wants something to be said. But then, yeah, just recognizing obviously like there's not one way to look Jewish, and that's problematic. And also the history of the particular like appearance that has been used as like a furthering oppression tool and like discrimination. So obviously there's a history with that, and just recognizing that as well. So it's our group.
Absolutely, that's it. I mean, so much propaganda has been circulated, particularly in the 20th century in Nazi Germany, of like Jewish people with these huge exaggerated noses as these grotesque, undesirable peoples, right? Like that's part of the othering. So absolutely, these things that persist in terms of how we visually imagine Jewish people can be really harmful, and also create a monolith of a people that are not monolithic in any way, shape, or form. So absolutely, that's brilliant. Just in the interest of time, let's jump to scenario 3, and then we'll wrap up. Final thoughts.
I can jump in here. Yes. Sorry, one thing I also kind of want to mention just for like as a team, like I'm cautious about terminology such as like giving agency, because it feels very like dominant, especially as like for myself, like as a non-Jewish person in these like hypotheticals, right? It feels very like dominant for me to say, or giving agency back, right? It's anyway, it's just something I am cautious of as well, and just wanted to mention. And then in terms of like this third scenario, we had a conversation about how so many assumptions are being made, right, about this person. And then I would probably, like, if I was part of this hiring panel, I guess I would probably like call that out, and then also just bring it back to the task at hand of like what Sandra's like what's it called, like the facts of their resume, right, and of their application, to bring it back to that, and to not make assumptions again about what that really means.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And that's a really interesting note about agency. Like, what does it mean to be in a position to even give agency to someone? I think, yeah, it's interesting to think about like what would be the best language. Think about a more collective process of imagining, I don't even know if inclusivity is the right word, but a more welcoming environment for everyone. So maybe agency isn't the word for some folks, maybe it's the word for other folks, but very important to think about. Thank you. I think we're at time, so I'm gonna wrap things up a little bit, but I hope this activity was helpful. You were able to apply like some of the things that you learned today and see what this will look like in practice. And these are all things that like I've heard folks in my community share with me that they've experienced, right? So this is not just, no, this would never happen, and I just imagine this up in La La Land. Like, these are very, very real scenarios, rooted in lived experience and research. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah, future directions. I mean, I really just wanted to close out by really underlining that, yes, Jewish oppression, anti-Jewish oppression looks different than anti-Black racism. They take different forms. For anti-Jewish oppression, it's more about scapegoating. And for anti-Black racism and for Black oppression, it's all about exploitation, putting the Black body to work and justifying the brutal treatment of Black folks through narratives of dehumanization. But at the end of the day, anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish oppression and anti-Black racism fundamentally undergird white supremacy. And we cannot get free if we don't imagine these freedom struggles as in tandem, as collective, as co-constitutive. And I hope we all leave with a better understanding of how important collective freedoms are. So thank you so much for having me. This has genuinely been a blast. I have loved being in conversation with you all. I'm available, like, feel free to email me. I'll share these slides with you all later. Follow me on socials if you want to, I guess, a little plug. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time and for caring to have the conversation.
Thank you so much, Raven. This was incredibly fast 2 hours. So much content, so much information. And thank you so much for kind of unraveling the complexity of it and explaining it to us. And I feel like I've gained a lot more clarity around anti-Black racism and the collective struggle and the interlinking oppression with white supremacy. So thank you so much for that. And sprinkling in that nuance and context is so important and so helpful. And I think can help inform how we communicate and talk about this as well in our trainings going forward. It's been a huge help.
Wonderful. Yay. So happy.
Yeah. Yay. Anything anyone else wants to say before we wrap up?
No, just a big thanks. Yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks for spending the morning with us, or afternoon for you. You're Chicago?
I am Chicago. It's now 1 p.m. I'm going to get some grub. I'm ready to eat.
Awesome. Thanks again, Raven.
Thank you.
Appreciate y'all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Take good care. Thank you.